to start, if you could just give an introduction of yourself so everybody knows who you are.
My name is Luis Sosa. I am the founder and head trader at Cosecha Traders. We're a specialty coffee importing company based in Cali, Colombia. And we source coffee from vulnerable smallholder farmers in southwestern Colombia.
And we've been working together for, well, we've been buying coffee from you guys for 2.5 years, 3 years now.
Yeah, I think almost 3 years now.
So to zoom in, and then we'll go over the sort of overarching idea of it all. Let's just focus on this harvest for right now. So how has this harvest been going?
Well, this harvest has been delayed. There'd been a lot of ideal climatic conditions, which is what I'd heard from a lot of the farmers that we work with. And then about a month ago, it started to rain a lot. Month and a half ago, overwhelming tropical rain. And I think that's what affected the flowering a great deal. We're expecting lower yields than what were originally anticipated, but you know how this works. It's kind of like when you have less coffee, it's easier for the smallholder farmers to process and to produce and to kind of, tailor into like a high-end specialty coffee. So in one end, it's good in terms of quality, but unfortunately, it's going to be a lower yield, which is what we're seeing. We had a shipment. We're still aiming to have a shipment hit the ocean in June, late June. But we have to kind of wait and see what's happening, with the way that the harvest is developing. Farmers are having a hard time drying their coffees at the farm level because of the rain. They have to take extra precautions and they have to do some extra work. The coffee that's coming in, it has to be put on hold in a way, and they have to be very careful with that because they don't want that to kind of be affected by the delays. But and then the coffee that's in the drying bed now is just we're kind of waiting. That's where we are at the moment.
One of the things that really stood out to me when we were talking about this briefly this past week was we're expecting to contract 45 bags from you guys, and we were working with Gilberto on obtaining those 45 bags because that seemed like the amount that he was going to be able to produce for this harvest season. Due to the weather conditions, that dropped by about 75%, roughly.
Yeah. Well, farmers like Don Gilberto, they still have a lot of challenges in terms of infrastructure. And a lot of it has to do with his capacity to standardize processes. The double fermentation, and then thinking about a naturals and a natural coffee, and that he has to have the right infrastructure in place in order to do that. But with regard to his production this time around, yeah, I mean the rain really affected it, because I remember all of our conversations before with Don Gilberto. He was expecting really high levels of production, and we were really excited about that. And then the rain started to come in, and then the reality also set in. Nonetheless, he's working to produce as much as he possibly can. And as I mentioned, he's very conservative in his projections.
Yeah. I mean, from a farmer's perspective, what sort of shift do you make to recover from something like that? Because I'm sure he had a lot of resources that he was dedicating towards producing that much volume. And then when something like this rainfall occurs, I mean, that's a huge hit in how much income that he could bring in. So is the shift now moving more towards whatever you can utilize from that crop into more experimental lots so that you can increase the premiums on that volume of coffee to make up for the loss?
If anything, I would say that, if he's able to produce, if the farm yields a less amount of high quality beans or cherries, then those cherries will go towards, specialty coffee production, and he'll go through the process and he'll deliver the quality that he's consistently delivered. But then the other part of the farm, which was also affected by the rain equally, and did not get like the same amount of nutrients and stuff, and in the soil and the sunlight, and has been affected by the rainfall, that is something that he can sell it at commerce, like in the to the Coffee Federation or to other buyers that he knows in that area. So he has like two product lines, or a farmer will have like two product lines. Now in other farms that I've seen, where farmers are from the get-go, they're totally focused on like experimental high quality lots. I mean, it kind of it's a trade-off. It's kind of like, they know that they can recover like a certain amount of investment from all the work that they've done and all that they've invested in that harvest. But then, for a better sale, for a higher price sale, in correlation with the quality of the coffee, right? But then the other coffee, those farmers still produce coffee that is kind of like commercial grade. So they'll have, a higher price from like the experimental quality coffee, and then they'll be able to sell the other coffees somewhere else.
Right.
And in terms of adjusting, I mean, like the short answer, to your question was that it's very difficult for them to recover and to adjust, because the way I've always seen it is you have a farm that has a certain amount of hectares, it's a certain specific determined size. And within that farm size and within that farm, you have a certain amount of trees that will produce a certain amount of coffee if all the conditions are right. And if they're not, then they'll produce less. And so they're always kind of challenged by that inability to control Mother Nature, or to be able to, maximize their investment, or their and their work, in terms of, and directed towards quality, even if you're producing the high end stuff. And this is kind of like something else that I've seen is that, farmers that are more industrialized or have understood this and been able to, get funding or to build infrastructure, and then in turn understand new trends in the market, for example, co-ferments and other experimental, quote unquote, experimental type of coffees. Those farmers are probably the ones that are going to, mitigate this whole storm, almost quite literally, of, the excessive rain and climatic conditions, because they've had the vision, and they've had the resources, economic resources, to develop that infrastructure, and then siphon in that coffee that they're producing at the farm level through some very well-established infrastructure.
Right. So essentially what I'm hearing is that there's two avenues for a farmer to go down. There's specialty grade coffee, which is anything over 80 and above. Because of the weather conditions, you're now forced to sell off a huge portion of your crop to more of a commercial grade processor, or just grading that coffee as commercial grade, which is under that 80-point score. So you're still able to make up some money back, but it's not in proportion to what you had considered before that rainfall occurred.
In addition, I would say that a lot of the inputs that farmers use, the fertilizers that they use, are still at soaring prices, due to like this whole global economic situation.
Right.
And so those prices are extremely high, and they've consistently gone up since the end of the pandemic. It's all through the pandemic and then to the end of the pandemic, but those prices are still high. So the farmers are paying a very high price for fertilizers that they're using to deliver the yield that they need on the farm.
Yeah.
But then the price is dropping and the yield is decreased. So then they have that challenge. It's almost like a natural disadvantage, that they have in managing like all these global, the global economy with like what's happening on their farm.
Yeah. Yeah, because that oil's found in these, or used in a lot of these fertilizers that farmers are implementing?
Yeah, I don't know the specifics on it, to be honest with you. But what I do know is that a lot of the countries where the fertilizers are produced have been affected by all of this international trade situation that's happened, and by all the other things that are happening in the world, the political issues and all of that. And this is
Yeah.
what I understand that has maintained the price of those fertilizers and those inputs high. And when you translate that into like Colombian pesos, you know, it's like an extremely, extremely expensive price to pay. A lot of farmers have thus resorted to creating their own, designing. They kind of like create and design their own fertilizers.
Yeah.
Based off of natural, you know, from compost, or they combine, instead of putting like, you know, fertilizing the farm 100% with like international inputs or fertilizers, then what they do is they use half of their own fertilizer and they combine it with another one to kind of mitigate the cost of it.
Yeah. Just because we're on the topic of sort of standard farming practices, we've talked about this a little bit in the past on organic certifications, really any certification in the coffee industry. It almost seemed like it was amusing to you because all of these certifications were things that the farmers that you were working with already had implemented. They just didn't have the resources to dedicate towards having somebody come out and verify everything and ensuring that, so that they could actually give them that stamp of approval. Could you describe a little bit about what some of those practices are with the farmers
Sure.
that you work with?
So the way it I've seen that it works is that the organizations that receive certifications are cooperatives or certain producer associations, and those, so they do it to get a premium price for their coffee. So if you're producing a coffee that's around an 80 point, borderline 80 point to 82 point coffee, you'll receive a premium for it because your cooperative or your association has received that certification. Now, the way that they get those certifications is that some of them or most of them are done on a yearly basis, where they travel, they send like kind of like auditing teams to the specific countries and the different cooperatives, and they kind of go through the whole checklist and they verify certain conditions on the farms and just make sure that everything's in line, so then they can receive that certification, or they get recertified for that following year. The other part of it is that, you know, when you have producers that are not, a lot of the farmers that we work with are in some very remote, kind of like vulnerable regions. So the cooperatives and the associations don't necessarily, they have interest in getting these certifications, but then organizationally, those associations lack the like their administrative capacity is also very limited. So they aren't necessarily capable of meeting all the requirements. They're interested in getting it because they want to get premium for their, you know, kind of like the lower tier specialty coffees, but then they don't have that capacity to make kind of like connect and get those certifications. What I've seen on a lot of farms, and this is something that, I don't know, where we work a lot in Cauca. It has a lot of cultural underpinnings. You know, there's a lot of tradition in coffee farming down here, and people are very proud of it. So, you know, it's like they inherit these processes from their fathers and their grandfathers, and then they continue to enact them, and they continue to produce, you know, kind of like your run of the mill Colombian specialty coffee or Colombian coffee. Okay. But then there are other farmers and who kind of like understand, like, I'll give you a specific example of working within some indigenous groups, that they use a lot of their cosmovision, or their perception of who they are, or who their community is, what their culture is, what their place is in the world, their understanding of nature, and then they'll treat their farm kind of like in this very harmonious, kind of like natural way, you know, like it's very amiable, you know. So they don't like to use any type of lab produced fertilizer. They prefer, and they almost always use like the natural composted fertilizers. Another thing that we've seen is that when a lot of farmers, they've used the like chemical inputs or chemical fertilizers, and then they're like, you know what? I don't like the way that my farm is kind of like reacting to this chemical fertilizer. And, we've had 2 or 3 harvests with this fertilizer. I want my farm to be a little more eco-friendly. I want it to be more sustainable. I want it to be, I want to conserve nature or the whole ecosystem a little bit better. And I'm going to use natural fertilizer, organic fertilizer. So what you see is kind of like the trees kind of react, and they have a lot of difficulty in delivering the same quality, and definitely they do not deliver the same output. They don't deliver the same yield. And this also, I've seen also that this affects the cup quality. Where you have organic coffees, a lot of them, they're a lot very floral, very delicate. Whereas the same farm would have had, would have sent us a sample, and the farm would have been much more fragrant, much more aromatic, much more intense. So, I mean, I think influencing that are like, the microclimates in the different regions, because some farms do react, very well to like entirely organic fertilizers. And again, it has to do with the ecosystem, how well that ecosystem's been conserved, how the farmers have treated the soils in the past.
So that was a lot that you were talking about. So I'm just trying to kind of wrap my brain around it.
Yeah.
Again, what I'm hearing is that in terms of the certification statuses, it's almost like there's more low-hanging fruit with more industrialized farms that are dealing with 80 to 82 point grade coffee, probably in part because of the geography, and because that's almost like where they're capped out in terms of quality because of the area that we're in. And for a region like Cauca, because the geography is so diverse and maybe the altitude's higher, it's a lot more difficult logistically to get up there, or to get the right processes in order to certify that this coffee is following all the necessary steps.
Yeah, that also, I'm sorry to interrupt, but like also in a lot of places, I mean, it's historically in Colombia, we've always had this tremendous gargantuan challenge of the cocaine trade, and everything that derives from that, the impact on local culture, local economies, national economy, and then just the value system, but in terms of security conditions, I know of a lot of NGOs that don't work in a lot of places where we purchase coffee. They know that there's a problem there. They know that there are some very, stark issues to confront, but they don't want to work there because it's too dangerous. And so then my question is, so then who are you helping exactly, where it's easy for you to access, like, and then, where is Colombia, or who's going to help the farmers in these regions in Colombia? Who's going to talk about specialty coffee? Who's going to train them on, organic methods of farming, or, different producing like different processes in for natural coffees or double fermentation coffees, the honey coffees. Who's going to do that? And in the end, it ends up becoming almost like a community-based effort. It's like people or farmers who have the vision, or have the vision to get out of their community, to speak to others from, in the capital, or to go find different answers and just become very curious about it. Just like maybe like you or I have become very curious and very passionate about this whole specialty coffee thing. They get out and they start to ask a lot of the questions, like, what if I do this, and what if I do that, and how can I do this? And so it becomes like community-led initiatives, and then with time, if security conditions improve, because they have not improved, they've actually worsened. In the last 2 or 3 years, they have worsened significantly. There's been a lot of combat. I hear a lot of Black Hawks, flying overhead constantly, all day long. And so this is happening in Cauca mainly, which is basically one of Colombia's most solid coffee countries. So security If we were to add something to the mix there, and like why certification, some cooperatives do have certifications and some don't. Security certainly influences everything like this in Colombia. And that doesn't say that doesn't mean that, and I don't mean to disqualify, any other of the certifications, because honestly, the farmers need a lot of help, and any initiative, any type of project that can lead to, an improved livelihood for me is a huge victory, and there needs to be more done, essentially to kind of have more dignified coffee trading in this part of the country for sure.